On April 26, 1986, a low rumble shattered the quiet night as Chernobyl's Reactor 4 erupted, sending radioactive debris across the sky and forcing thousands from their homes. The world remembers the explosion, but the real story, the silent combination of engineering flaws, rushed decisions, and a misunderstood reactor design, remains tangled in decades of confusion and conflicting reports. To understand what really happened at Chernobyl and why a simple safety test became the worst nuclear accident in history, we must look inside the reactor itself. Inside the core of Chernobyl's Reactor 4, rows of vertical channels pierced a massive stack of graphite blocks. Each channel held a slender tube filled with uranium dioxide fuel pellets, sheathed in zirconium alloy, and cooled by water pumped under high pressure. This arrangement, known as the RBMK design, was both ambitious and unconventional. Instead of a single compact vessel, the reactor core stretched over 12 meters in diameter, an intricate lattice of more than 1,600 individual fuel channels, all threaded through the graphite moderator. The graphite served a critical role. In nuclear fission, uranium atoms split and release fast-moving neutrons. To keep the chain reaction going, these neutrons must be slowed down. Graphite, a form of pure carbon, is an excellent moderator. It slows the neutrons just enough so they can trigger more fission events in the uranium fuel. In the RBMK, this moderation happened throughout the entire core, not just around the fuel rods. The graphite blocks formed a dense matrix, creating a three-dimensional web that allowed neutrons to bounce, scatter, and sustain the reaction efficiently. The water that flowed through the channels had a double duty. It cooled the fuel, carrying away the immense heat generated by fission, and it also acted as a neutron absorber, helping to regulate the reaction. This balance, graphite to moderate, water to cool and absorb, was the heart of the RBMK's operation. But it also introduced complexity. If water turned to steam inside the channels, its ability to absorb neutrons dropped sharply, while the graphite kept moderating. This meant that steam bubbles, or voids, could actually speed up the reaction rather than slow it down, a property known as a positive void coefficient. Another distinctive feature was the modular construction. The reactor core consisted of stacked graphite columns, each with its own fuel channel. This design allowed for online refueling, meaning operators could replace spent fuel assemblies without shutting down the reactor. It was a practical solution for continuous operation, but it also made the core more sprawling and less contained than Western reactor designs. Unlike many Western reactors, the RBMK lacked a full steel and concrete containment structure. Instead, it was housed in a reinforced building designed to keep the core dry and shielded from the environment, but not to withstand a major internal explosion. This absence of robust containment would later prove to be a critical vulnerability. Within this complex architecture, control rods moved up and down through their own channels, designed to absorb neutrons and regulate the chain reaction. The unique combination of graphite moderation, water cooling, and channel-type construction made the RBMK both powerful and flexible. Yet, as later events would show, these same features created hidden risks, especially during unstable operating conditions. Understanding this internal geometry is essential for grasping how a routine test could spiral into disaster. On the night of April 25, 1986, the staff at Chernobyl's Unit 4 prepared to carry out a safety test with a clear, practical objective. The Soviet electrical grid demanded a reliable backup in case of a sudden power loss. If the main power supply to the plant failed, the emergency diesel generators would take roughly 40 to 60 seconds to reach full power. During that gap, the reactor's cooling pumps, vital for removing heat from the core, needed to keep running. The test aimed to prove that the momentum, or inertia, of the massive steam turbine could generate enough electricity during this coast-down period to bridge the gap until the generators kicked in. This was not the first time such a test had been attempted. Previous runs at other units had failed to confirm the turbine's ability to supply adequate power, and Soviet engineers saw this final attempt at Unit 4 as a chance to resolve the question once and for all. The procedure called for the reactor to be at a stable, moderate power level, ideally above 700 megawatts thermal, to ensure predictable behavior. Operators would then disconnect the turbine from the grid, allowing it to spin down naturally while monitoring whether the slowing generator could continue powering the main coolant pumps. The test itself was an electrical experiment, but it required precise coordination with the reactor's nuclear systems. To prepare, the operators began reducing the reactor's power output. This was timed to coincide with a scheduled maintenance shutdown, which allowed the test to be carried out just before the reactor would be taken offline. However, as the power was lowered, the reactor's behavior became less stable. The design of the RBMK reactor made it particularly sensitive to changes at low power, but the full implications of this were not widely understood by the staff on duty. Certain automatic safety features were deliberately bypassed to prevent them from interrupting the test. For example, the emergency core cooling system was disabled hours before the procedure, and several protective interlocks were switched to manual mode. These steps were taken to avoid a premature shutdown, which would have forced the test to be abandoned. Yet each manual override removed a layer of protection, leaving the reactor more exposed to unexpected conditions. The written test protocol was brief, focusing mainly on the electrical aspects and assuming the nuclear side would remain stable. There was no requirement to abort the test if the reactor dropped below a safe power threshold, nor did the instructions account for the specific risks of low power operation in an RBMK reactor. The night shift, less experienced and unfamiliar with the details, inherited a situation that was already more precarious than it appeared. By the early hours of April 26, 1986, Unit 4 was running at a fraction of its normal power. Operators had set up the test conditions as best they could, relying on manual controls and overrides to keep the system within the parameters needed for the experiment. The stage was set for the turbine coast down test, but the technical and procedural choices made during preparation had quietly undermined the reactor's safety margin. Anatoly Dyatlov, deputy chief engineer, stood at the center of the control room as the night shift worked through the early hours of April 26th. Dyatlov's presence was formidable. He had a reputation for strictness and impatience, and his word carried weight among the operators. The staff, Alexander Akimov, the shift supervisor, and Leonid Toptanov, the young reactor control engineer, were both aware of the pressure to complete the test before the scheduled maintenance shutdown. The reactor's power had dropped much lower than planned, falling to around 30 megawatts thermal, a fraction of the intended level. This plunge was caused by xenon-135, a byproduct of fission that absorbs neutrons and acts as a powerful brake on the chain reaction. In nuclear engineering, this is known as xenon poisoning. When the reactor runs at low power, xenon builds up and suppresses reactivity, making it difficult to raise power again without intervention. To counteract the poisoning and reach the required test conditions, the operators began withdrawing control rods far beyond normal limits. Control rods are designed to absorb neutrons and keep the chain reaction in check. According to standard procedures, at least 30 rods should remain inserted at all times to maintain a safe operational margin. By the time the test was ready to proceed, only about 6 to 8 rods remained in the core, well below the required minimum. This left the reactor in an unstable, highly reactive state. Logs and testimony from that night indicate that Dyatlov insisted on continuing, urging Akimov and Toptonov to push the reactor back up to the target power. Each move was made under pressure, with Dyatlov dismissing concerns and alarms as irrelevant to the reactor's safety. The operators, less experienced and uncertain, followed his directives, overriding automatic safety systems and relying on manual controls. Raising the reactor's power under these conditions required further withdrawal of the rods, compounding the instability. The RBMK design did not make the consequences of this clear to the operators. With so few rods in place, any sudden change, such as a shift in coolant flow or a spike in steam bubbles, could cause the chain reaction to accelerate uncontrollably. The technical term for this is loss of operational reactivity margin, a state where the reactor becomes sensitive to minor disturbances. By the time the turbine test was ready to begin, the core was riddled with hidden vulnerabilities. Xenon poisoning had masked the underlying instability, and the withdrawal of control rods had pushed the reactor into a brittle, unpredictable state. The pressure to complete the test, combined with gaps in training and incomplete procedures, left the operators with few options and little room for error. Every decision made under Dyatlov's supervision that night moved the reactor further from safety, setting the stage for what would follow. Within the RBMK reactor, certain design features quietly set the stage for instability, especially during low-power operation. One of the most consequential was the positive void coefficient. In simple terms, this means when water in the cooling channels turned into steam, creating pockets called voids, the reactor's power output actually increased rather than decreased. This happened because water in the RBMK acted as both coolant and a neutron absorber. When it boiled away, fewer neutrons were absorbed, but the graphite moderator kept slowing down neutrons, fueling the chain reaction. The result was a feedback loop. More steam led to more reactivity, which led to more heat, and then to even more steam. This self-reinforcing cycle was especially dangerous when the reactor was running with only a handful of control rods inserted, as was the case just before the accident. The positive void coefficient was not a theoretical quirk. It was a well-documented property known to Soviet reactor designers since the early days of the RBMK program. Internal memos from the Nikiet Design Institute, some dating back to the late 1970s, warned about the risk of uncontrollable power surges during certain operational states, especially at low power, with few control rods in place. Despite these warnings, the issue was never fully addressed. The RBMK reactor's ability to operate at low power, combined with its unique moderation and cooling arrangement, made it particularly susceptible to rapid, hard-to-control increases in reactivity if conditions changed unexpectedly. Another hidden hazard lay in the control rods themselves. In most reactors, inserting a control rod into the core quickly reduces reactivity by absorbing neutrons. But the RBMK's control rods were built with graphite tips, followed by a short section of empty channel filled with water, and only then the boron carbide absorber. When a shutdown was triggered, such as by pressing the D5 button, the graphite tip entered the core first, displacing neutron-absorbing water with neutron-moderating graphite. For the first few seconds of insertion, this design caused a local spike in reactivity, especially in the lower part of the core. Only after the graphite tip passed through did the absorber take effect and begin to dampen the chain reaction. The graphite tip was a critical and counterintuitive design detail. This so-called positive scram effect was not widely understood among reactor operators. Yet records show the phenomenon had been observed at other RBMK plants before 1986, including at the Ignalina station in Lithuania. Test results and internal reports described unexpected power surges during shutdown attempts, but these findings were largely confined to technical circles and never translated into comprehensive safety protocols or operator training. The graphite tip effect, combined with the positive void coefficient, created a situation where the very act of initiating an emergency shutdown could momentarily accelerate the chain reaction instead of halting it. The design choices that made the RBMK powerful and cost-effective also made it vulnerable under the wrong conditions. When operators at Chernobyl withdrew too many control rods and allowed steam voids to grow in the core, they unknowingly set up a system ready to amplify even minor errors. The reactor's physical characteristics, positive void feedback, and the graphite-tipped rods meant that small disturbances could trigger rapid, unpredictable changes in power. These embedded flaws remained largely invisible to the staff on duty, even as they worked through the night, unaware that the physics of the reactor itself had quietly removed the margin for safety. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, a sequence of events unfolded inside Chernobyl's Reactor 4 that lasted less than a minute, but changed the course of nuclear history. The test was underway, and the reactor was already in a precarious state, operating at low power, with most control rods withdrawn and key safety systems disabled. When the operators pressed the AZ5 button, intending to shut down the reactor, the control rods began to descend into the core. Instead of immediately halting the reaction, the graphite tips at the end of each rod displaced neutron-absorbing water and replaced it with graphite, a neutron moderator. This design flaw caused a sudden local increase in reactivity, especially in the lower portion of the core, where water had been boiling away and steam voids had formed. Within seconds, the chain reaction accelerated sharply. The positive void coefficient of the RBMK meant that as more water boiled into steam, the reactor's power output increased rather than decreased. The feedback loop was self-reinforcing. More steam led to more reactivity, which led to more heat, and then to even more steam. The reactor's power, which had hovered at a fraction of its normal output, surged to a level estimated at more than 100 times the nominal maximum. This surge was not gradual. It happened in less than 5 seconds. The fuel rods, now subjected to extreme temperatures and rapid power increase, began to rupture. Fuel assemblies fragmented, and the zirconium cladding reacted with steam, producing hydrogen gas. Steam pressure inside the channels soared. The sudden buildup of pressure blew the caps off several fuel channels, breaking the graphite moderator blocks and distorting the core's geometry. At approximately 1:23 and 40 seconds a.m., the pressure inside the reactor vessel exceeded its design limits. A powerful steam explosion tore through the core, lifting the 1,000-ton upper biological shield, the massive concrete and steel plate that covered the reactor, straight up and off its supports. This initial blast ruptured the reactor building's roof and walls. The force of the explosion ejected pieces of fuel, graphite, and structural debris high into the air. Some of this material landed on the roof of the adjacent turbine hall, while other fragments fell back into the open core, now fully exposed to the atmosphere. The explosion also jammed many of the control rods halfway into the core, making further shutdown attempts impossible. Moments later, a second, even more violent explosion followed. The precise cause is still debated, but most analyses point to a combination of additional steam pressure and the ignition of hydrogen gas formed by the reaction between superheated zirconium and steam. This second blast scattered burning graphite and radioactive fuel throughout the facility and into the night sky. Fires broke out across the plant, including on the roof and inside the reactor hall, igniting the graphite moderator blocks and creating a plume of radioactive smoke. These explosions did not just destroy the reactor, they breached the last barriers separating the radioactive core from the outside world. The absence of a full containment structure, unlike Western reactors, meant that nothing stopped the release of radioactive material. In the span of less than a minute, the core went from unstable to destroyed, and the plant's defenses were shattered. The mechanical failures and design flaws had converged with critical procedural missteps, resulting in a disaster whose consequences would soon reach far beyond the walls of Chernobyl. At 1:28 in the morning, just minutes after the explosions, the first fire brigade arrived at Chernobyl's Unit 4. The men stepped into a scene of confusion and chaos, chunks of graphite burning on the roof, debris scattered across the plant, and a strange blue glow rising from the shattered core. There was no warning about radiation. The firefighters, led by Lieutenant Vasily Ignatenko, wore standard gear meant for ordinary blazes, not for the invisible hazard now saturating the air. Their assignment was clear: contain the fires and prevent them from spreading to the neighboring reactor units. Ignatenko and his team climbed ladders and hauled hoses through thick smoke and falling debris. They tackled flames on the turbine hall roof where burning graphite fragments had landed. Without specialized protection, they were exposed to intense doses of gamma radiation and radioactive particles. Some firefighters later recalled a metallic taste in their mouths and a sensation of pins and needles on their skin, early signs of acute exposure. Within hours, several would collapse, vomiting and unable to stand. Medical records show that Ignatenko received a fatal dose. He died in a Moscow hospital on May 11th, less than 3 weeks later, from acute radiation syndrome. His colleagues suffered similar fates. In total, 28 plant workers and first responders died within the first 3 months, most from radiation injuries sustained in those initial hours. Inside the plant, operators like Alexander Akimov and Leonid Toptanov tried desperately to restore cooling water to the destroyed reactor, believing at least for a time that the core might still be intact. They worked in the dark, surrounded by steam and radioactive dust, manipulating valves and pumps by hand. Both men received lethal doses and died in the hospital days later. Their efforts, though ultimately futile, slowed the spread of fires and bought precious time for evacuation planning. Outside the plant, life in Pripyat continued almost as usual that Saturday morning. The city, home to nearly 50,000 people, was just 3 kilometers from the reactor. No public announcement was made. Children played outdoors, and workers went about their routines, unaware that radioactive iodine, cesium, and other isotopes were drifting silently over the city. Radiation levels in some areas soared to hundreds of times the natural background, but the official response was slow and cautious. Local roads were blocked by police in the early hours, but residents were not told why. Hospitals began to fill with patients complaining of headaches, nausea, and a strange redness of the skin. It was not until the afternoon of April 27th, about 36 hours after the explosions, that authorities ordered the evacuation of Pripyat. Buses lined up in long columns, and residents were told to bring only essentials. The announcement insisted the move was temporary, a precaution for a few days. In reality, most would never return. Over the following weeks, the evacuation zone expanded to include a 30-kilometer radius, eventually displacing more than 115,000 people from their homes. The delay exposed tens of thousands to unnecessary radiation, a decision later criticized in official investigations and international reports. Records show that the priority was to avoid panic and maintain public order, even as radioactive fallout continued to spread. The first responders at Chernobyl acted with extraordinary courage, facing dangers they could not see or fully understand. Their actions limited the immediate spread of fire and contamination, But the lack of information and protective measures came at a terrible cost. The delayed evacuation of Pripyat remains one of the most consequential decisions of the disaster, an example of how policy failures can compound a technical crisis and turn a reactor accident into a public health emergency. In the days following the explosions at Chernobyl, Soviet authorities imposed a near-total blackout on information. Official statements offered only vague reassurances, and state television made no mention of the accident for almost 3 days. Inside the Soviet Union, residents of nearby cities and even many plant workers' families remained unaware of the true scale of the disaster. Local newspapers and radio stuck to routine programming, while rumors spread quietly among those who noticed unusual activity or sudden evacuations. On the morning of April 28, 1986, workers arriving at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden triggered radiation alarms as they entered the facility. The contamination was traced not to any Swedish reactor, but to dust on the workers' clothing. Radioactive particles carried hundreds of kilometers by the wind. Swedish authorities quickly analyzed the isotopes and identified them as products of a nuclear reactor accident, not a weapons test. Within hours, similar reports came in from Finland, Denmark, and Norway, all registering unexplained spikes in radiation. Swedish officials contacted Moscow for clarification, but received no immediate response. As the evidence mounted, Sweden notified the International Atomic Energy Agency, and news agencies across Europe began reporting the mysterious increase in radioactivity. It was only then, under mounting international pressure, that the Soviet government issued a terse announcement acknowledging an accident at the Chernobyl plant. The statement, broadcast on April 29, 1986, described the situation as under control and mentioned only 2 deaths, omitting any details about the scale of the release or the risks to the public. This contrast, silence, and denial at home, followed by alarm and investigation abroad, shaped the world's first understanding of the Chernobyl disaster. The delay in admitting the accident, coupled with the lack of reliable information, fueled confusion and anxiety both inside the Soviet Union and across Europe. Western media filled the gaps with speculation, while Soviet citizens relied on rumors or foreign radio broadcasts. To piece together the truth, the handling of information in those first critical days not only undermined trust in official statements, but also influenced how the disaster would be remembered and debated for decades to come. In the aftermath of the Chernobyl explosion, the scale of human displacement and health consequences became apparent over weeks and years. Within 36 hours of the accident, authorities ordered the evacuation of Pripyat's population, nearly 50,000 people who left behind homes, belongings, and daily routines with the expectation of a short absence. Over the following weeks, the exclusion zone expanded to a radius of 30 kilometers, encompassing dozens of villages and towns. By the end of 1986, more than 115,000 residents from the surrounding region had been relocated. In the years that followed, as contamination maps were updated and radiation levels reassessed, the total number of people resettled reached approximately 500,000. The exclusion zone remains one of the most visible legacy of the disaster. Stretching over 2,600 square kilometers, it is a landscape of abandoned settlements, forests, and contaminated soil. Entry is strictly controlled, and only a small number of workers, scientists, and former residents, known as Samosli, are permitted limited access. The long-term social impact of this forced migration is difficult to quantify. Families were separated, communities dispersed, and entire towns erased from the map. Many evacuees faced psychological stress, economic hardship, and uncertainty about their future. compounded by the stigma of being associated with radiation exposure. Health effects from Chernobyl's radioactive fallout have been the subject of extensive scientific study. The most clearly documented consequence is the sharp increase in thyroid cancer among children and adolescents who lived in contaminated areas of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Between 1991 and 2005, more than 6,000 cases of thyroid cancer were diagnosed in individuals exposed as children. This surge is linked to the release of radioactive iodine-131, which accumulates in the thyroid gland, especially in young people. The risk was heightened by the lack of timely warnings and the absence of stable iodine tablets, which could have blocked the uptake of radioactive iodine. Other health trends, such as increases in leukemia, solid cancers, and non-cancer illnesses, have been more difficult to attribute directly to Chernobyl, given the complexities of tracking long-term, low-dose exposure across large populations. International agencies, including the World Health Organization and the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, continue to monitor and refine estimates. While the immediate death toll from acute radiation syndrome was limited to a few dozen, the broader public health impact remains a subject of ongoing research and debate. The consequences of Chernobyl radiated far beyond the plant itself, reshaping the lives of hundreds of thousands and leaving a zone where time seems suspended. The scale of relocation and the persistent health concerns underscore the enduring legacy of the world's most serious nuclear accident. International attention soon turned to the question of responsibility. Early Soviet reports placed the blame squarely on the operators, citing procedural violations and unauthorized actions during the safety test. Yet, as more evidence became available, especially through the work of independent experts and international agencies, the narrative began to shift. The International Atomic Energy Agency Post-Accident Review, INSAG-7, brought a new level of scrutiny to the underlying reactor physics and engineering choices. Investigators found that the RBMK reactor's design included multiple vulnerabilities that made such an accident not only possible, but likely under certain conditions. Valery Legasov, chief of the Soviet Investigative Commission and a leading nuclear chemist, played a pivotal role in this process. At the 1986 IAEA hearings in Vienna, Legasov presented a technical analysis that acknowledged operator mistakes, but also outlined the RBMK reactor's unique hazards. He described the positive void coefficient, the graphite tip control rods, and the absence of a robust containment structure as critical factors. Legasov argued that these design flaws created a system where minor procedural errors could escalate rapidly into catastrophe. His testimony, later supported by his private recordings and diaries, revealed how warnings about these vulnerabilities had circulated among Soviet scientists for years, but were never fully addressed by plant designers or regulatory authorities. INSG-7's final report reflected this broader understanding. The panel concluded that the RBMK reactor's physical characteristics, especially its instability at low power, and the positive scram effect caused by graphite-tipped control rods were the primary contributors to the accident. While the operators did violate certain protocols, the investigation found that the written procedures themselves were incomplete and failed to anticipate the dangerous interactions between reactor physics and human intervention. The RBMK reactor's susceptibility to rapid, uncontrollable power surges was not adequately communicated to plant staff, nor was it properly mitigated in the design. In response to these findings, Soviet authorities ordered extensive modifications to all remaining RBMK reactors. The control rods were redesigned to eliminate the graphite tips, and and additional fixed neutron absorbers were installed to reduce the positive void coefficient. Automated safety systems were enhanced, and new operational guidelines were issued to prevent operation at unstable low-power conditions. These retrofits addressed the most critical flaws identified by the investigation and have since been credited with preventing similar incidents at other plants. The consensus reached by international and Soviet investigators established that the Chernobyl disaster was not the result of a single error or individual decision. Instead, it was the outcome of a complex interplay between human actions, ambiguous procedures, and deep-seated design weaknesses. This recognition fundamentally changed the global approach to nuclear safety, shifting attention from operator blame to the necessity of robust engineering and transparent oversight. Today, the legacy of Chernobyl shapes every debate about nuclear safety. Investigations show it was not just operator mistakes, but deep-seated reactor design flaws and institutional secrecy that led to disaster. Misinformation and delayed reporting amplified fear, altering global perceptions of nuclear energy. As new reactors emerge worldwide, transparency and rigorous engineering remain critical. The enduring lesson is clear. When systemic flaws go unaddressed, consequences extend far beyond any control room. Share your perspective in the comments below.